After offering to babysit so they could rest, I accidentally let the baby nap too long. My daughter-in-law stormed in and screamed, "You could have killed her!" My son took the child without a word. I walked out and opened the storage box in my trunk. Inside was a legal file that would change everything once it reached the judge's desk. "She's not safe here anymore. She's not breathing right. What did you do?" The words hit me like a slap across the face before I even had time to process that Leora had entered the room. I was standing beside the crib, my hands hovering over my granddaughter's sleeping form, watching the slow, peaceful rise and fall of her tiny chest. And then Leora was right there, inches from me, her face twisted into something I had never seen before, a wild, terrified fury that turned her eyes into two dark storms. She shoved past me and scooped the baby up with movements so frantic I stepped back automatically, afraid she might drop her in her panic. I felt my heart hammering, felt the words forming in my throat, but she cut me off before I could speak a single syllable. "She's just napping," I started, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "She wouldn't settle earlier, I thought." "You thought?" She spun around, clutching my granddaughter against her chest, and the word landed like an accusation I had never expected to face. "You thought it was okay to let a newborn sleep this long? You could have killed her." And then Daniel was in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, and his eyes moved from Leora to me and back again in a slow sweep that told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lived. He crossed the room without a word, took the baby from Leora's arms with practiced calm, pressed two fingers gently to the infant's neck, watched her chest, tilted his head to listen to her breathing. Then he turned away from me just like that, turned his back on me as though I were already gone. I'm Evelyn Hale, 62 years old, and I have spent the better part of my life believing that I know best. That is not arrogance, or at least it has never felt like arrogance from the inside. It has always felt like experience, like hard-won wisdom, like the kind of knowledge that only comes from having raised children yourself, from having survived the sleepless nights and the fevers and the scares that come with keeping another human being alive. But I carry that certainty like a weapon I don't always know I'm drawing. I can walk into a room and within 10 minutes I have reorganized it in my mind, cataloged what is wrong, begun planning how to fix it. It is a flaw, though I did not always call it that. I called it dedication, I called it love. And beneath all of it, beneath the composed exterior and the practical hands and the voice that rarely wavered, there was something harder and more troubling, a need to be right so deep it had become indistinguishable from the person I was. My daughter-in-law Leora had sensed it from the beginning. She was 30 years old, quick and fierce, the kind of woman who met every perceived threat with her jaw already set and her eyes already measuring the distance. She had never trusted me alone with the baby, and I had always told myself that was because she was anxious, because she was new at this, because she hadn't yet learned to let go. I had never once considered that maybe she was right not to trust me. As I walked out of that nursery and down the hallway and through the front door, I heard her voice carry clearly from inside. "She's not safe here anymore," and something in me that had been bending for a long time finally snapped clean. I sat in my car in their driveway for longer than I should have. The afternoon light was going gold and flat, turning everything around me into something that looked like a painting of a life rather than a life itself. My hands were folded in my lap and I was not crying because I have never been someone who cries easily, and because the thing moving through me was not sorrow yet. It was colder than sorrow, harder at the edges. It was the kind of feeling that comes before a decision. I had been dismissed before. I had been made to feel unnecessary, overcautious, outdated in my views. Daniel had been doing that quiet erasure for years, every time he said nothing while Leora laid down a new rule, every time he smiled at me over her head with an expression that said, "Please don't make this harder." But this time was different. This time the words, "She's not safe here," were echoing around inside my skull, and instead of feeling the usual wave of shame and retreat, I felt something else rising. I got out of the car. I walked around to the trunk. I lifted the lid of the weathered wooden storage box I had been carrying in that trunk for 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which I had watched and worried and told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that families went through hard patches and came through them whole. Inside the box was a thick legal file. The cover page read "Petition for Emergency Custody Review," and my name was at the top as the petitioning party, and my granddaughter's name was below it, and below that were the names of her parents. I stood there in the fading afternoon light looking at my own name on a document that had the power to shatter everything, and I told myself it was concern. I told myself it was love. I wasn't ready yet to look at what else it might be. I had started putting the file together 6 weeks earlier, which means I had already been thinking about this before the incident with the nap, before Leora's scream, before Daniel's turn back. That is important to understand, and it is something I did not want to understand at the time. I had begun to notice things, or tell myself I was noticing things, around the time I visited on a Tuesday afternoon and found the baby crying in her bouncer while Leora slept on the couch. I noticed the dark circles under Daniel's eyes that never seemed to lighten. I noticed the tension between them that crackled at the dinner table and went unaddressed, buried under small talk and the determined fiction of a household running smoothly. I got copies of the baby's medical records, and I will not explain how because that explanation does not make me look good. And I found 2 missed checkup appointments and notes about weight fluctuations, and a notation from the pediatrician about parental fatigue and household stress. I kept a notebook. I wrote down dates and times and what I observed. I photographed the kitchen once when I visited and it was in disarray, and told myself this was documentation rather than intrusion. I contacted a lawyer named Miriam Voss, a practical, sharp-featured woman in her late 40s who looked at me over the rim of her glasses with an expression that contained equal parts professional neutrality and personal skepticism. "Walk me through your concerns," she said during our first meeting, and I did, and at the end she was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Hale," she said carefully, "I want to make sure we're pursuing this for the right reasons." "What other reasons would there be?" I asked, and she looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. I should have listened to that silence. Instead, I took it as agreement. "I need you to be honest with me," Miriam said at our second meeting, spreading the file across the table between us. "Are these children in genuine danger, or are you trying to prove a point?" I felt heat rise in my neck. "They are struggling. The baby is not being properly monitored. Those are facts. The baby is within normal growth parameters, and her last checkup, though slightly delayed, showed no health concerns. The missed appointments are concerning, yes, but they don't constitute neglect. They constitute exhaustion. 2 overworked new parents who could probably benefit from more support." I looked at her steadily. "That's what I'm trying to provide." She took off her glasses and set them on the table. "Mrs. Hale, what you're trying to provide is control. There's a difference." I left that meeting feeling stiff with offense, and I did not call Miriam for 2 days, and when I did call her I told her I wanted to move forward with filing. She was quiet on the phone. Then she said, "All right, but I want you to understand what you're setting in motion here." "I understand perfectly," I said, and I believed that. I genuinely believed that. The conviction that I was right had become so total, so load-bearing that I could not have questioned it without something in me collapsing entirely. So I did not question it, I kept building. I hired a pediatric consultant named Dr. Ansel Rook, a measured, even-tempered man of 55 with the kind of face that gives nothing away and the kind of voice that makes everything sound inevitable. He reviewed the medical records I provided and came back to me with an assessment that was far less alarming than I had hoped. "The weight fluctuations are within normal range," he said over the phone, and I could hear him turning pages. "The missed appointments are worth addressing but don't indicate systemic failure. I'd need considerably more evidence of actual harm before I could support an emergency custody action." "You haven't seen the household," I told him. "You haven't seen how they are. Can you document specific instances of harm or serious risk?" "I can document exhaustion and instability." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale," he said, and he did sound genuinely sorry, which was somehow more frustrating than if he hadn't. "That describes most new parents I encounter. It is not the same thing as danger." I thanked him and hung up and sat for a long moment, feeling the first real tremor of doubt move through me, not enough to stop me but enough to feel. I pressed it down. I told myself the professionals were not seeing what I was seeing. I told myself that a grandmother's knowledge was different from a doctor's knowledge and in some ways more true. That is pride speaking. I know that now, but at the time it felt like conviction. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from another meeting with Miriam, and when I saw his name on my phone I let it ring twice before I answered, bracing myself. "Mom," he said, and his voice was strange. It had a quality I had not heard in it before, something stripped bare. "Tell me you didn't file." I said nothing. "Mom, did you file preliminary custody papers?" "I filed a request for review," I said, careful with the words. "Because someone needs to." "Someone needs to what?" His voice cracked, and I heard something underneath it that took me a moment to identify as grief. "Someone needs to take our baby away from us. Is that what you think we deserve?" "Daniel, listen to me. I have real concerns over a nap." "It was more than the nap. It has been more than the nap for months, and you know that." "I know that you've been watching us like we're suspects," he said, and now I could hear Leora in the background, her voice low and urgent, and I imagined her standing just off to the side listening to every word. "I know that you copied our daughter's medical records without asking us. I know that you've been talking to lawyers and doctors and God knows who else. I know all of that, Mom, and I am telling you right now." He stopped, drew a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. "You're trying to take our child over a nap. That's not what this is." "Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like that." I opened my mouth and closed it and opened it again, and what came out was, "I love her. I love that baby more than you know." "Then act like it," he said, and hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call. Not dramatically, not collapsed or broken, just sat, my back against the cabinets, looking at the baseboards across the room, letting the silence expand around me. The doubt that I had been pressing down for weeks pushed up harder, and for a moment I almost called Miriam and told her to stop everything. Almost. But then I thought about the medical records, about the missed appointments, about Leora's face twisted in panic and Daniel turning his back on me, and the words, "She's not safe here anymore." And the doubt receded again, buried under the weight of my own certainty. I had a neighbor named Patricia who had witnessed an argument between Daniel and Leora through her window one afternoon, and I had spoken to her about testifying. She called me the following morning. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "I'm not comfortable with this anymore. They're good parents. They had a bad day." "Everyone says that until something goes wrong," I told her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't be part of this." I put the phone down and stared at the wall and told myself I didn't need Patricia. I told myself I had enough. And underneath that, very quietly, something was beginning to understand that I was not gathering evidence anymore. I was building a case around a conclusion I had already reached, and that those are very different things. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined and colder than the season outside explained. I had dressed carefully, dark blue, professional, understated, because I understood that I was not just making an argument here, I was being assessed, and I wanted to be assessed as competent and measured and entirely sane. Leora and Daniel were already seated when I arrived. Leora was in a pale gray blouse and she was holding the baby, healthy, wide-eyed, looking around the room with the bright, curious alertness of a child who is entirely fine, and she held her so deliberately, so visibly, that I understood it as the statement it was meant to be. "Look at my child, look at how well she is, look at what you're doing." Daniel sat beside her. He did not look at me. Miriam set her files on the table and touched my arm briefly. "Are you ready?" "Yes," I said. I was not ready. I understood that even then, but the machinery was moving and I did not know how to stop it without it crushing something important. Miriam presented the case in clear, measured language. Concerns regarding parental fatigue, missed medical appointments, a pattern of household instability, the incident with the supervised sleep. She laid it out like a structure, brick by brick, and I sat and listened and told myself it sounded reasonable. Then came the cross-examination. The opposing attorney was a woman in her 40s with very still eyes and the kind of patience that feels like a form of aggression. She turned to me and said, without raising her voice at all, "Mrs. Hale, isn't it true that you were the one supervising your granddaughter during the incident in question?" "Yes," I said. "And you allowed the child to sleep for nearly 6 hours without checking vital signs." I felt the phrasing land. "I monitored her, but you did not wake her. You did not contact the parents. You made a judgment call based on your own assessment of what was best, correct?" The pause that followed felt very long. "Yes," I said. "And you obtained copies of the child's medical records without the knowledge or consent of her parents." I looked at Miriam. Miriam's expression did not change. "I did," I said. "You engaged a legal team, a medical consultant, and at least one neighbor witness in preparation for this petition?" "Yes." "And your conclusion, based on all of that preparation, is that these parents, who according to every medical professional who has testified here today are raising a healthy, well-attached infant, are somehow unfit?" "I believe they need support," I said. "I believe the situation was deteriorating and nobody was." "Nobody was what, Mrs. Hale?" "Nobody was paying attention except you." I looked at my hands on the table. "Yes," I said very quietly. "I thought so," she said and turned away. Dr. Rook testified next, and he was precise and fair and ultimately devastating in the understated way that measured people are when they tell the truth calmly. He confirmed that the baby's health was good. He confirmed that the missed appointments were a concern but did not indicate neglect. He confirmed that his review of the household evidence I had provided did not support a finding of endangerment. When asked whether he believed the petition had merit, he paused for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own answer, and then said, "I believe Mrs. Hale is genuinely concerned about her granddaughter's welfare. I also believe that genuine concern and legitimate grounds for intervention are not always the same thing." Then Daniel took the stand. I watched my son walk across that cold room and settle into the witness chair, and he looked older than 34, older and more composed than I had ever given him credit for, and I felt something complicated move through my chest. He spoke clearly and quietly. "We asked for help," he said, his voice carrying that stripped-bare quality I had heard on the phone. "We never asked for anyone to take over. We never asked for anyone to decide for us that we weren't good enough. We asked for help. There's a difference between help and control, and somewhere along the way that difference got lost." He looked at me then, not with anger, which I could have handled, but with something much harder to bear. A sorrow that included me, that placed me firmly in its center. "I love my mother," he said. "I know she loves our daughter, but love isn't enough if it turns into something that feels like being watched, like being judged, like waiting for someone to declare you unfit for a job you're doing your best at." He stopped, looked down at his hands. "We just needed space, not saving." Leora was last. She sat in the witness chair like she was made of something harder than bone, and she looked at me the entire time she spoke, not away from me, directly at me, and her voice did not shake once. "She didn't want to help us," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think the framing of this whole case has been about a grandmother's concern, and I want the court to understand what I actually experienced. She wanted to replace us. She wanted to be the one who knew best, who did things right, who proved that we were failing. She has been building this case for months while sitting in our home and holding our daughter and telling us she loved us, and that is not love. That is something else. I don't have a clean word for it, but it is not love." I felt each sentence go through me like something physical, not anger, not defensiveness anymore. Something closer to recognition, the kind that hurts precisely because it is accurate. I looked down at the table in front of me. I looked at the legal file that Miriam had assembled from my notes, my photographs, my stolen records, my second-hand witness accounts, my relentless conviction that I knew better. I looked at all of that and I felt, for the first time, not righteous but ashamed. Judge Elric Dane had a face built for delivering difficult truths, broad, weathered, with eyes that had spent decades sorting genuine concern from something less clean. He looked at the file. He looked at me. He looked at Daniel and Leora and the baby in Leora's arms. Then he spoke in a voice that did not need volume to fill the room. This court has heard testimony from medical experts who confirm this child is healthy and well cared for. It has heard testimony from both parents demonstrating attentiveness, love, and the kind of exhaustion that is entirely consistent with new parenthood rather than negligence. It has heard from the petitioner a story of concern that is not in question. I do not doubt Mrs. Hale's love for her grandchild, but concern does not justify overreach, and what has been presented here today is overreach of a significant kind. He set the file down. There is a line, he continued, between caring about someone and deciding you know better than they do how their life should be managed. When that line is crossed, especially within a family, the damage is not only legal, it is personal, it is intimate, and it is often very difficult to repair. He looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was. Control is not care, Mrs. Hale. I hope you will carry that with you. He paused once more. The petition is dismissed. I walked out of that courtroom the way I had walked out of Daniel and Leora's house on the day this all began, in silence, with my head up, because I am a woman who has never known how to let herself fall apart in public. The late afternoon outside was gray and cool, smelling of exhaust and coming rain, and I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment just breathing it in. Listening to the traffic and the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea what had just happened to me inside that building, Miriam came out behind me. She stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I want you to know that I told you this was a risk." "You told me a lot of things," I said. "Yes," she said, "I did." She put a hand briefly on my shoulder, a professional gesture, a human one, and then she went down the steps and got into her car and drove away, and I was alone on the courthouse steps with the full weight of what I had done settling onto me in layers I had not expected. I had not expected the shame. I had expected, if I lost, to feel wronged, to feel that the system had failed to see what I saw, that the professionals had missed the signs, that I was a grandmother standing outside a closed door while something preventable happened on the other side. I had not expected to walk out of that courtroom feeling, for the first time in months, like I was the one who had done something that needed to be answered for. The weeks after the dismissal were the quietest of my life. My phone did not ring with Daniel's number. No visits were scheduled and no visits happened. I cooked meals for one and ate them at a kitchen table that had once seated a family, and in the evenings I sat in the chair by the window where I used to read and instead just sat, watching the light change in the street outside, thinking about the judge's words in the way that important things echo, not constantly but suddenly at odd moments, like a sound that surfaces when everything else goes quiet. Concern does not justify overreach. Control is not care. I replayed the courtroom in the specific, punishing way that memory operates when it is trying to teach you something, not the broad strokes but the details, the texture of individual moments. Leora's face when she said she wanted to replace us. Daniel's voice breaking on the phone. Miriam looking at me across the office table with that careful expression and saying, "Are you sure this is about the right reasons?" The consultant's pause before he answered the question about merit. Even Patricia, the neighbor, saying they're good parents, they had a bad day, and me overriding her because I was so certain that my perception of a situation trumped everyone else's lived experience of it. I had built something out of love and turned it into a weapon, and the worst part, the part I kept returning to in the evenings in the quiet of my house, was that I had known, somewhere beneath the certainty, what I was doing. There had been a version of me watching the whole process unfold and recognizing it for what it was, and I had pressed that version down and buried her under files and consultations and the endlessly renewable fuel of my own pride. One morning, about 6 weeks after the dismissal, I was in my kitchen with my coffee, looking out the window at the bare maple in the backyard when I heard the mail slot. I didn't move right away. I had gotten used to opening the mail with a kind of emotional neutrality, bills, advertisements, nothing that mattered. I finished my coffee, then I walked to the front door. In the small pile of envelopes on the floor was one without a return address, but I recognized Daniel's handwriting before I even picked it up. I stood in the hallway for a moment, holding it, feeling the weight of something I could not name before I even opened it. Inside was a single photograph. My granddaughter sitting upright now, which she hadn't been able to do when I last saw her, supported by some kind of cushioned ring, wearing a yellow onesie and looking directly at the camera with an expression of such concentrated delight that I felt something in my chest simply give way. She was smiling. She was radiant. She was entirely, obviously fine. And beneath the photograph was a note card in Daniel's handwriting. the letters careful and unhurried, as though he had thought about each word before he committed it to paper. "We're okay. We just needed space, not saving." I stood in the hallway of my house and I looked at that photograph and those 9 words and I allowed myself to cry, finally and quietly and without any audience, which is the only way I know how to do it. Not because I had lost, but because the photograph was an act of grace I had not earned, and recognizing that I had not earned it was the clearest and most honest thought I had managed in months. I walked to my car eventually. The storage box was still in the trunk. I had not moved it because I had not been ready to decide what to do with it, and there is something true about the things we leave in car trunks, the decisions we circle without making. I opened it. The legal file was still there, thick and neat and organized, representing months of effort and certainty that had brought me to a courtroom and then out of it, alone. I took the photograph out of my pocket and held it beside the file for a moment, the smiling baby and the stacked papers, and I thought about what Miriam had asked me at the beginning. Are these children in genuine danger, or are you trying to prove a point? I had told myself it was the first thing. I had behaved as though it were only the first thing. But the truth, the one I had been avoiding for the better part of a year, was that it had been both, and the second motive had done its work quietly and steadily, contaminating everything the way a single drop of something bitter can ruin a whole glass of water if you pretend long enough that it isn't there. I placed the photograph inside the box. I placed it on top of the legal file, the baby's smile covering my careful documentation of her parents' failures. Then I closed the lid. Then I locked it. Not to protect the file, not because I still believed in what was inside it, not because I was storing it against some future use. I locked it because I needed the act of locking to mean something, needed some physical gesture to mark the moment I was choosing to put this down and not pick it up again. I stood in the cold air beside my car for a long moment with my hand on the closed lid of the box, and I let myself understand clearly and without softening what I had done and what it had cost everyone and what it had cost me, and that the cost was fair. Then I went back inside. The maple in the backyard was still bare, but there were small tight buds at the ends of the branches, and spring was maybe 2 or 3 weeks away, which is not very long if you stop measuring time by what you've lost and start measuring it by what might still come back. I didn't call Daniel that day. I didn't write a letter. I understood enough, finally, to let the space be space rather than fill it immediately with more of myself. But I kept the photograph on my kitchen table in the square of afternoon light that came through the window, and every morning when I came downstairs I looked at it, my granddaughter, smiling, entirely fine, and let it remind me of something I should have known from the beginning, something that turned out to be much harder than caring for someone. The discipline of caring for someone without needing them to need you. That is the hardest thing I know, and it is the lesson I am still, every single day, learning to carry.